What's up guys, Mike here, and today we're going to be talking about the 1962 NBA season. Now this is the season where Oscar Robertson averaged a triple-double and Wilt averaged over 50 points a game. And people often use those numbers in historical arguments, which raises the question, is it fair to use those numbers? Because basketball in the 1962 season was very different than it is now. So today, we're going to go into the numbers from that era and see just what they would mean in today's game. Throughout the early 1950s, the NBA had a problem. Games were too slow. With no shot clock, teams had no incentive to rush shots. These longer possessions eventually led to teams holding the ball for minutes at a time. The most extreme example of this coming on November 22nd, 1950, where the Fort Wayne Pistons defeated the Minneapolis Lakers by the riveting score of 19-18. Predictably, this decrease in scoring also led to a decrease in fan activity, as people had no interest in watching a basketball game where they didn't play basketball. Enter the creation of the shot clock. After a successful pitch to the NBA, the shot clock was implemented for the 1954 to 1955 season. Overnight, the league's scoring average rose by almost 14 points per game, and again, fan interest was up. But then, scoring continued to increase, and suddenly by the 1962 season, the NBA's team scoring average was 118.8 points per game, and the Philadelphia Warriors, Wilts team, led the league with a ridiculous 125.4 points per game. The league's lack of defense and absurd amount of possessions led to some equally absurd individual statistics. In the 1962 season, for instance, 5 players averaged over 30 points per game, and 4 players averaged over 15 rebounds per game. Oscar Robertson averaged a triple-double for a season. Elgin Baylor averaged 38.3 points per game. Bob Pettit averaged 31.1 points per game and 18.7 rebounds per game. And none of those 3 players just named finished in the top 2 of MVP voting. The MVP for the 1962 season was Bill Russell, who led the Boston Celtics to the best record in the NBA while putting up 18.9 points and 23.6 rebounds per night. All of these numbers were dwarfed, though, by the season that Wilt Chamberlain had, because in the 62 season, Wilt averaged a staggering 50.4 points per game and 25.6 rebounds per game. By today's standards, those stats aren't just great, they're incomprehensible. However, if we dig deeper into these numbers, things start to make more sense. Okay, so before we go into Wilt's numbers, I want to go over some arguments and counter arguments. Now, when discussing these numbers, a lot of people bring up that the game was white back then and there were no European players, which led to Wilt being able to dominate more. But I don't really buy into that, because the NBA also only had 9 teams, which means there were 1/3 the amount of players in the league that there are today, so only the best players in the world were playing in the league at that point. Now, the second argument you'll hear when discussing Wilt's numbers is that he was much taller and stronger than players during that era. But I don't believe in that argument, because how are you going to penalize him for being stronger and taller than someone? Shaq was the strongest player in the NBA. No one penalized him for it. And Yao Ming was the tallest player in the NBA. No one was saying, oh, Yao's stats don't count, he's too tall. And the third argument is that offensive goaltending was allowed during this era. However, it's impossible for me to really adjust his stats based on that unless I went through every single game and saw every single instance of offensive goaltending and subtracted it from there. So, taking a look at Wilt's 1962 season stats, they clearly look insane, right? Well, as I said before, in 1962, the pace of play was much faster. Teams then had considerably more possessions, averaging 107.7 field goal attempts per game than they did in 2016, where teams averaged only 84.4 field goal attempts per game. So to modernize Wilt's stats, we must adjust them based on the possessions per game now. Here's how that would look. Still very impressive, right? Well, we're not done, because we still have to take into account minutes per game. In the 1962 season, Wilt averaged an absurd 48.5 minutes per game, which means he averaged more minutes than there are in an actual basketball game. This happened because of various overtime games throughout the season, though even with overtime games, Wilt would never approach those numbers today. In the modern NBA, the game has become much more physically demanding and teams have gotten smarter, so players' minutes are limited to a certain degree. The leader in minutes per game in 2016 was James Harden with 38.1. So if we are modernizing Wilt's numbers, his minutes have to be modernized too. For argument's sake, we will give Wilt 38.1 minutes per game, tying him with the leader in minutes per game. So when adjusted for possessions and minutes, Wilt's new stats look like this. Now, things make a lot more sense. 31 and 16 is still an elite stat line, but it doesn't seem impossible. Now, to further emphasize just how ridiculous the stats were in 1962, let's take a look at some of the players we talked about earlier. Here are Elgin Baylor, Bob Pettit, and Bill Russell's stats in 1962. Again, they look crazy, but when we adjust them, they also look much more realistic. Now, Oscar Robertson is famously known for averaging a triple-double for a season, but when his stats are adjusted, they become much more comparable to a season that a modern-day player such as Russell Westbrook could have. And speaking of modern-day players, let's take a look at what would happen if the script was flipped, and today's stars had their stats adjusted as if they were playing in 1962. And yes, I took 3-pointers out of the points per game. So the 2016 NBA MVP will be Steph Curry. This year, he averaged 30.1 points per game, 5.4 rebounds per game, and 6.7 assists per game. If his stats were adjusted, however, he would have averaged 40.9 points per game, the third most in NBA history, on top of 11 assists and 9 rebounds. Those numbers are just as ridiculous as Wilt's 1962 numbers. Looking at some other players, LeBron would average a triple-double with adjusted stats. Durant would just miss one, and Andre Drummond would average an awesome 25.2 rebounds per game. And Westbrook, the player who had the most triple-doubles this season, would put up an incredible 36 points, 17 assists, and 13 rebounds a night. Those numbers don't even make sense. But then again, neither did the numbers put up in 1962. And so, as we compare the adjusted stats between the stars of 1962 and 2016, 2 final points must be made. The first is that the rebounding numbers of the 62 stars will be higher regardless of the adjustments, due to lower shooting percentages that season. The second is that the assist numbers in 2016 are also noticeably higher, which makes sense, because scorekeepers in the early NBA years had much stricter requirements for an assist. Thank you guys for watching, and man, those 1962 adjusted numbers were insane. And while I did just do all this, I did the math, it took me a while, but whatever. I just want to say that Wilt averaging 50 points a game, even when you adjust the stats, even when you do everything, it's just absurd. You still have to put 50 points in a basket, which is very difficult. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and please subscribe if you haven't already. I'll make a bunch of NBA content, you won't regret it, and guess what? You'll be here before we hit 100,000 subscribers because we are so close, guys. Again, thank you for everything. Thank you for all of your support. A 100,000 subscriber special is coming. It's going to be basketball themed. Don't you worry about it. And as always, have an awesome day, my dudes, and cue that music.